Brancaccio.
For much of his career as a consultant in international development, John Perkins says he was an empire builder, though maybe not in ways that you'd think. Perkins calls himself an economic hitman, a kind of secret agent of U.S. power, armed not with a Walther PPK pistol, but a set of corrupt economic spreadsheets. His job, he says, was to convince developing countries to borrow money to build expensive projects like roads, dams, and power grids that would ostensibly improve quality of life, but there was a catch. These projects would also leave these countries with more debt than they could ever hope to repay. This crushing debt, Perkins says, left those countries with little choice but to follow America's lead on foreign and economic policies. His controversial book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 11 weeks.
Well, John Perkins, welcome to Now.
Thank you. It's great to be here, David.
One of the things about reading your book is that you have to just take it on faith that you're being upfront. I don't mean to be unkind, but even something as basic as the word in the title, economic hitman. I mean, it sounds like something a publisher came up with, but you say this is the term that was actually used in the biz.
Well, we used it tongue-in-cheek, but the term was one that really stuck with us because, in fact, what we were called upon to do was very similar to what mafia hitmen do, except we were a lot more efficient about it, a lot more secretive, a lot more professional, and did it on a much larger scale.
You know, it's true that organized crime does use debt to exercise control. There's a way to do that. When someone is in hock, they are in your thrall, in a sense, and you've seen it in this country. You're really translating that to the international sphere. Yes,
it's a game that's very, very old. It's been played by empires for a long time, and we've taken it to a whole new level of perfection since World War II, and especially in the last, the last 4 decades. In fact, we've managed to create what I believe is history's only truly global empire. And for the first time, we've created an empire primarily without the military. When the Romans or the conquistadores or the English or the French sent their armies out to the world and created these empires, everybody knew they were doing it. The armies were obvious. But we've done it in a way that's much more subtle, a way that many people in the United States still believe that most of our aid is altruistic. It isn't altruistic for the most part. It's done in the process of creating this empire.
But just for the sake of living with yourself when you were a younger man, I mean, you must have said to yourself, I am helping the population of this developing country, be it Indonesia, be it someplace else, by bringing, for instance, a hydroelectric project to them. Yes, it'll cost them a lot. Yes, they'll have to borrow a lot. But ultimately, you must have been guided by the sense that you're trying to help out poor folks.
Well, that's what I'd learned in business school, and that's the model that the World Bank presents. But if you really get to know these countries, and I did, I spent a lot of time in them, what I saw was that the money that was going to build these projects, like the hydroelectric projects, or the highways or the ports, hardly ever actually made its way to the country. The money was transferred from banks in Washington, D.C. to banks in Houston or San Francisco or New York, where most of it went to big U.S. corporations, ones we hear a lot about these days, like Halliburton and Bechtel. And these corporations then built these projects, and the projects primarily served the very rich in those countries. The electricity, the highways, the ports were seldom even used by the people who needed them the most. But the country would be left holding a huge debt, and it would be such a large debt that it couldn't possibly repay it. And so at some point in time, we economic hitmen would go back to the country and say, look, you owe us a lot of money, you can't pay your debts, therefore sell us your oil at a real cheap price, or vote with us at a UN vote, or give us land for a military base, or send some of your troops to some country where we want you to support us.
You think that from the word go, that this kind of lending was meant to essentially put these countries into hock?
There's no question in my mind. This was what I was intended to do, was to go out and create these projects that would bring billions of dollars back to U.S. corporations and create projects that would put these countries into such deep debt that in essence they became part of our empire. They became our slaves in a way. And it's important to understand that what I was doing was not illegal. It is not illegal. It should be, but it isn't. Now, if I were a banker and I were to go to you and convince you to take a loan that I knew you'd never be able to repay, that's criminal. I could be taken to court for that. I'd be
Yeah, it's like
arrested.
selling a naive investor some sort of fancy investment vehicle. It's against the law.
Exactly. It's against the law. But on the international scale, it's not against the law. We write the laws. And if you go to the textbooks in the business schools, you'll see that increasing gross national product is touted as something that's good for development. And we usually did that. However, in most of these countries, or many of these countries, when you increase gross national product, you may only be increasing the wealth of a very few families who own most of the major resources in the country. The people who live off subsistence farming and other activities, or close to subsistence, don't gain anything. In fact, you build a hydroelectric dam across their river, it destroys much of the life downstream, it destroys their farms, it destroys their fishing, it does them a great deal of damage, and they're left holding this debt that should be going to pay for their education, health services, other social services, but can't because it's owed to us. The reason I wrote the book, David, is because finally, after 9/11, I realized that the American people must know what's going on because most Americans don't know. And 9/11 was just symbolic of a tremendous amount of anger around the world. And we in the United States are not aware of that. I mean, September 11th made us somewhat aware of it, although I think we've really covered that aspect of it over. We say this was a rogue terrorist.
Or that it's based in sort of a religious passion, or that it's something about Saudi Arabia in particular. This isn't really about the United States and its international relations. That's the argument.
That's the argument. But in fact, if you go to Catholic countries in South America, you'll see that Osama bin Laden is a hero amongst a lot of people. He's on billboards. He's on T-shirts. It's very unfortunate that this mass murderer has become the symbol of a David who's standing up to a Goliath, the way they see it. He's like a Robin Hood to many people. 24,000 people die every day from lack of nutrition. 30,000 children die every single day from diseases for which we have cures, for which we have medicines. And that shouldn't be happening. It doesn't need to happen. That's over 50,000 people every single day dying terrible, painful, awful, needless deaths. So 3,000 at the World Trade Center was atrocious, terrible. 200,000 or whatever at the tsunamis is atrocious and terrible, and they make the news. But these 50,000 plus that die every single day needlessly don't ever make the news. And their families and the people in those countries are very angry because we could prevent that. And in fact, our policies, and especially many of our corporate policies, foster those kinds of conditions that create situations where those people are dying of lack of nutrition and lack of medicines.
There will be Americans who reflect on this and say, look, we tried. We tried to share the wealth, and for whatever reason it came to naught.
We didn't try to share the wealth. We Americans believe that that's what we're doing. We're good-hearted, compassionate people. But the fact of the matter, the ones who make the decisions, I was in that position. There's a lot of people out there today in that position. They're getting very wealthy. Their corporations are getting wealthy. And a few families in these developing countries who collaborate with us in this process are getting fabulously wealthy too. But the poor are getting much poorer, and the gap between rich and poor has increased tremendously over the last 30 years. Over this time when the World Bank and the United Nations has told us that we're making improvements, in fact, the gap has more than doubled.